is everyone feeling? Ready for this? Well, I'm very excited to be here. I am Walidah Imarisha, and for the past 4 years, I've been touring around Oregon presenting a talk called Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? A Hidden History. So if you can name a small town in Oregon, I've probably been there talking about the history of race, identity, and power. And I chose to name the program, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon, to just get it out front, right? Because I think many people, when they first come to Oregon, this is one of the first things that crosses their minds. It was certainly one of the first things that crossed my mind when I moved to Springfield, Oregon to finish high school. And I think that, one of the reasons I wanted to be very explicit is that Oregon does not like to talk about race. We as a nation don't like to talk about race, but we actually have to explicitly talk about race and talk about the history of race, identity, and power, which affects us today. And so I've had folks come up with many very interesting answers to this question before they see the program, everything from black folks don't like the rain, to black folks didn't make it this far west, as if we just petered out around Chicago. Woo! I just couldn't make it any further than this, right? And these ideas are ridiculous, and yet because Portland is thought of as such a sort of liberal mecca, folks really can't conceptualize or bring themselves to talk about things like institutional racism as an answer to this question, but absolutely have to be one of our answers. In that vein, I've met many Oregonians who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union a free state, right? Now, it's true that in 1844, Oregon outlawed slavery. But the truth is much more complex than that. This is a slide from my Oregon Black History timeline. I'm just going to show you a few of them. The full timeline is about 70 slides, and you can access it on YouTube if you just look up Oregon Black History timeline. So in 1844, when Oregon was still a territory, it outlawed slavery. It also outlawed black people. It banned black folks from moving to Oregon and included the brutal lash law that said that black people would be publicly whipped every 6 months until we left Oregon. So the answer to the question, why aren't there more black people in Oregon, is actually very clear and very simple, because Oregon did not want black people here. Oregon actually conceptualized of itself as a white homeland. And in that context, it was both anti-slavery and anti-black. And when I say that, a lot of times people are like, my mind is blown, how is that possible, right? Because we tell these very ahistoric racial myths, many of them. One of them being, if you were anti-slavery, you were pro-racial justice. That's not the case. So black people were anti-slavery because of racial justice. There were many allies of color and white allies who were anti-slavery because of issues of racial justice. But there were many more white folks in this country who were both anti-slavery and anti-black, because for them, slavery was a question of economics. In this country, there were two economic systems happening up into the 1800s, right, up until the Civil War. In the North, you had industrialization, right, factories based on exploited, usually immigrant labor. In the South, you had an economic system based on chattel slavery. They were in conflict with one another. And so those folks who owned those factories, the bosses, they didn't like slavery. But they didn't like slavery because it messed with their money. They were both anti-slavery and anti-black. And you can go back and read propaganda that they aimed at white working class folks that said things like, well, white working class folks, the reason you can't get a job, or the reason your pay is so low and you work under such unsafe conditions for such long hours, it's not us, the people who own the factories, it's these enslaved black folks. We can't compete with them. They're taking your jobs. Have you maybe heard that rhetoric past 1865, right? This is why I actually really want to challenge folks that this notion we talk about history as this straight linear progression towards greatness is absolutely false. I think that at its best, history is a spiral, right? At its worst, history is just a circle where we run around repeating the same issues over and over again, right? All of this is incredibly important because this is where Oregon was birthed. Oregon was birthed in this context of being anti-slavery and anti-black under the foundation of being a white homeland, right? Oregon was created as a racist white utopia. The call went out, come to Oregon and get away from the problems of the day, which was code word for people of color. Come and build the sort of ideal white society that you've dreamt about, right? And folks came and answered that call. And so that's why in 1859, Oregon became the only state in the Union to be admitted with a racial exclusionary clause in the Constitution. It banned black folks from living in Oregon, from holding real estate, or from making contracts. So in essence, black folks were the first undocumented people in Oregon, right? We don't say illegal alien, that's an offensive term, so undocumented folks. I think that, again, this is important. History is a spiral. We've had these conversations in Oregon about who is considered a citizen, who should get access to basic human rights, who is even considered human, right? And at that time, to be black and to be in Oregon was to be considered a criminal by the state. The other piece that's incredibly important to recognize about this is that this language was in our Constitution until 2001. So until 2001, the racial exclusionary clause banning black folks from living in Oregon was in our Constitution. And to be clear, that was not an oversight. It wasn't, some people have said, oh, well, there's a lot of stuff in the Constitution, can't keep track of it all. That's not the case, right? That's not the case because for decades, black folks came to the legislature and to the people of Oregon and said, please remove this language from the Constitution. Please tell us this is not the kind of place that you want to live. And over, Oregon left it in, reinforcing, actually, this is exactly the kind of place we want to live. And for anyone who was here in 2001, you remember it was a fight to get that language removed in 2001. It passed by the slimmest of margins, and there was immense pushback. Much of the pushback centered around the idea of wanting to preserve Oregon's history, right? Which many folks heard as wanting to preserve this history of a racist white utopia, right? So I think that this is also why I don't like to call this history. I call this a living legacy because it walks with us every day. 2001 was like yesterday, y'all, right? This is important to know for Oregon, but this is actually important to know about the entire country. Because the only thing that's unique about Oregon, the only thing that makes Oregon special, is Oregon was bold enough to write it down and reinforce it again and again and again. But the same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon shaped every state in the nation and shaped the nation as a whole, because it's incredibly important to remember America was founded as a racist white utopia, right? So the concept of manifest destiny, which is the founding principle of America, is the idea that God gave this land to white folks to make it productive because indigenous people were not using it properly, and that white people had the right to do whatever was necessary, including theft of land, chattel slavery, and genocide, to do that by God's edict. So we have a quote here from an American senator that says, God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-admiration. No. He has made us the master organizers of the world to establish systems where chaos reigns. He has made us adept in government, that we may administer government among savages. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night, right? This was said not in 1600, not in 1800, but in 1900. So this ideology, which is the founding ideology of America, is reinforced throughout the centuries, right? It's reinforced on a national level, and it's also reinforced here in Oregon. And Oregon, again, is a useful case study because Oregon was bold enough to literally write it down in black and white and reinforce it over and over again, right? So many folks say, okay, well, Walidah, this is a very interesting little tidbit of history. Thanks. Maybe it proves that Oregon is racist. I don't know about that. But what I do know is this is all old history and it has nothing to do with us today, right? That actually couldn't be farther from the truth. The reality is that Oregon is founded in this. The institutions that shape all of our lives are rooted in this history. And the very conception of how Portland sees itself is rooted in the exclusion, containment, and exploitation of people of color, right? So this notion of Portland that has been, epitomized by Portlandia, we all know, right? Which in essence is basically a white liberal playground, right? That's what Portlandia is. That is predicated on this history of Oregon being a white homeland. Because the access resources that were used to create this sort of liberal landscape, everything from bike lanes to the greenery to being a model of urban planning nationally, all of that comes from the direct neglect of resources going to communities of color who historically and currently have contributed socially, politically, and especially economically to Oregon and to Portland. So those resources were hoarded away from those communities who were contributing into it. That's why there were excess resources to create this sort of white liberal landscape. So Portlandia is rooted in the containment, exploitation, and exclusion of people of color. And we actually see, looking at current statistics, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So the Portland Housing Bureau issued a report earlier this year that found that if you are Black, if you are Latino, if you are Indigenous, you cannot afford to live in Portland, right? All those red no's, all the way across. You can't afford a studio, a one-bedroom, let alone a house. You cannot afford it, right? This is the structural ways that white supremacy is manufacturing itself. And the means may be different than explicitly saying you cannot come here. But if the ends are the same, right, that at the end of the day, Portland becomes a white-only city, then we have to ask, has anything really changed? And also, we have to ask, how liberal is Portland really, if this can continue and folks are fine with that existing in perpetuity, right? So the last point that I want to make, because I don't want to leave y'all today, start off your day with everything was terrible, everything is terrible, enjoy the rest of the event, right? I really want to leave us with the agency and leadership of people of color who have been working in this state tirelessly for centuries to make this state a better place for everyone in it, right? There were actually never supposed to be Black communities in Oregon at all. Right? It's amazing that Black communities and any communities of color exist in Oregon. And it is due entirely to the determination, perseverance, creativity, and sheer stubbornness of communities of color that they exist. People of color have never been passive victims in this history. They have been active change makers. And in light of that, people of color do not need white folks to come in and save them, right, with sort of a liberal gospel. What we need are folks who will take the vision and leadership of those folks of color, right? So people of color don't need saviors, they need allies. And what we see is that when the leadership of people of color is centered and when allies follow the lead of people of color, folks of color actually create communities and community institutions that make all of our lives better. And I want to just explore two examples really quickly. And so the first happened in 1867 when the city of Salem refused to allow Black children to go to school. The schools were segregated. Black children were not allowed to go. There was not a school for them. So the Black community engaged in a two-prong approach in Salem. First, they raised $427.50. That was a lot of money in 1867, y'all, to open a school to educate their children. They also engaged in a lawsuit to force the city of Salem to take over the economic responsibilities of that school, and they were successful. So because of the organizing of this marginalized and oppressed community in 1867, public education was more accessible for everyone. I want to jump to 1969 with the Black Panther Party. There's a lot to say about the Panthers, so I'm going to stay focused. So the Panthers were a national organization with over 40 chapters across the nation. The program that every chapter was mandated to have was a survival program called the Free Breakfast for Children program. So the Panthers fed tens of thousands of children of all races across this country every day. And in fact, in 1969, the California treasurer said that the Black Panther Party fed more children than the United States government. That's actually why we have free and reduced lunch programs, because the government was basically shamed by the Panthers and had to begin that program soon after. The other program that many of the chapters had were healthcare clinics. In Portland, we had a free breakfast program, and we actually had 2 healthcare clinics. The first was a general healthcare clinic, and the second was a dental clinic. These clinics were open to everyone, free of charge. The only questions you were asked when you came in were, what's wrong with you, and how can we help make you better, right? So when the Panthers actually, Oregon Health Sciences University took over their dental clinic, and it's actually still running today in Northeast Portland. So because of the Black Panthers organizing in that community, because of the marginalized and oppressed communities organizing to create institutions to address the needs the larger society was not addressing, that community has had access to, under the Panthers, free dental care, and under OHSU, low-income dental care for almost 50 years. And I think that this is just an incredible example that shows that when we, again, center the leadership, the voices, and the vision of those communities that have been marginalized, it actually makes all of our communities, our state, and our nation a safer, healthier, and more whole place. So thank you all so much for having me. Enjoy the rest of your event.